This is probably the most excited I've been to make a Samsung smartphone review, well, ever. And what's interesting is that I'd actually say this is one of the smaller upgrades we've seen for the Galaxy S series, and yet it's possibly the best one we've had in a long time. I'm talking about Samsung finally ditching Exynos and giving us Snapdragon processors worldwide, which means no more arguing about which version is better, no more unfair treatment of customers just because of where they live in the world. Everyone gets the best version of the phone. We're going to look at all three new phones, the S23, the S23 Plus, and the S23 Ultra, and of course we're going to cover everything that's new. So whether you're unsure if you should get one of last year's S22 series and want to see just how much the latest phones have improved, or even if you know you want a new S23 but are not sure if you want the regular, the Plus, or the Ultra, this is the video for you, and we're going to explore all of this. I've spent a while with these phones now gathering my full thoughts on this year's lineup, so let's get into it and why this might actually be the best Galaxy upgrade ever. Since we've already covered the unboxing, we can get straight into this new design, and from the front, you could easily mistake these for last year's phones. We have the same shape design with the rounded corners on the S23 and Plus, and those both have flat displays, whilst the Ultra has that boxy squared off design with a slight curve on the front glass. But you'll see that the dimensions are almost exactly the same as last year, so these are essentially going to feel identical in the hand. Still, there are minor changes like an antenna rearrangement, a new air vent hole, and the slightly higher button placement. You can distinguish the new phones by looking at the back, because the S23 and Plus both ditch the camera bump and just have the individual lens cutouts like on the Ultra. Personally, I do think this looks better, a bit more sleek and minimal. I like the uniformity this brings across the whole S-series lineup, and the phones now don't rock as much on a desk, so that's great news for you brave/crazy people who go caseless. With the Ultra, it's a bit more of a subtle change, but you may have spotted that the camera lenses are slightly bigger and more pronounced this year, though the design template certainly remains the same. Annoyingly, it does mean that last year's phone cases are not going to fit. We of course also have new colours. I have here the new cream S23 replacing the whiter S22 finish, lavender for the S23 Plus, a slightly lighter shade than last year's Bora Purple, and for the Ultra I decided to get this vibrant lime green, which is one of Samsung's online exclusives and is very striking. Alongside the minor cosmetic update, we get the new Gorilla Glass Victus 2 to improve durability, though the aluminium frames and IP68 dust and water resistance remain the same. It's really pleasing to see Samsung using a lot more recycled materials in their build this year as well, and I hope that they continue to take positive steps here going forwards. How much of an improvement the new glass will actually offer remains to be seen, but any durability improvements are always welcome. It's of course going to come down to personal preference whether you prefer the design of the regular S23s or the Ultra, and personally, I've always been in the rounded corner regular camp. I just think these are better looking phones. The flat display and symmetrical bezels are a key part in that too, and although the Ultra's slight curve trims down the side bezels, it still has a thicker chin and slightly larger hole punch, so aesthetically, I prefer the S23s. Those rounded corners feel nicer in the hand and in your pocket, plus the ergonomic benefit of the smaller S23 especially is really nice. Don't get me wrong, watching movies on the Ultra's 6.8-inch display is great. You've got more space when gaming, or even just for simple web and social media browsing, and you're given an S Pen to help navigate that huge canvas. But the compact 6.1 inches of the regular S23, for me at least, strikes the sweet spot. It feels great in the hand, is not too heavy, and makes reaching the corners of the display and buttons, one-handed use, gaming, and portability all easier. So the size of the phone will play a big part in choosing between these three, maybe even the biggest factor of all, but there's clearly no significant design departure from last year's S22 series. That's not really a bad thing in my opinion though, and I'd go as far as to say the S23 and Plus are the best looking smartphones right now. It's a simple and clean aesthetic for sure, but when the novelty of things like the Pixel 7's visor or other more outlandish alternatives wears thin, I appreciate the S23 design even more. Let me know in the comments if you agree, or name a better looking smartphone. Looking more closely at those displays, there's only one notable spec bump for the S23, which increases the peak brightness up to 1750 nits, matching the Plus and Ultra. So day to day, you're unlikely to notice a significant difference from last year's phones, but it does mean with things like HDR, the S23 is now brighter, and you're no longer missing out on brightness if you prefer the smaller form factor. The curve on the Ultra's glass is now slightly flatter than last year's as well, further reducing the risk of accidental touches, which I'm personally well on board with. Otherwise, we're looking at the same display sizes, colours, resolution, 120Hz refresh rates, and the same ultrasonic fingerprint scanners as last year. The fact is that these are gorgeous displays that are super fast and responsive and easy to read outdoors. It's also worth reiterating that only the Ultra has a 1440p resolution, whilst the others are both 1080p, which means that the S23 has a sharper display than the bigger S23 Plus. In reality, you need to pixel peep to really spot those differences, and the size of these displays is easily the biggest factor that you should consider when deciding between them. For those wondering about the speakers, they tend to improve in terms of loudness and bass as the phones get bigger, so the Ultras are the best. But compared to last year's phones, I do think they sound slightly better.
What does perfect even mean? Is there even such a thing? Ooh, can we switch up all the rules and imagine a utopia? Darling, I'm just so fed up with these expectations. They keep weighing me down. My heart is begging me.
Moving on to the hardware, we have the same RAM options as last year with 8GB, but the Ultra also gets a 12GB option with the higher storage models, and with those you may see slightly better multitasking and holding a few more apps open in the background. But it doesn't fundamentally change the way you use the phone day to day, so don't get too distracted by the specs. As has been the case in previous years, if you even slightly question whether you need 8 or 12GB, 8 is going to be absolutely fine for you. 12 is ready for the power users who want to get the best experience they possibly can from the Ultra. What you should focus on is simply choosing the model with the storage amount that you need. It's a bit confusing because only the S23 offers 128 or 256GB, the Plus model offers double this, and then the Ultra offers an additional 1TB option. Don't forget there's no expandable storage with a microSD card, so if you're not sure or if you're going to keep the phone for a few years, then I'd go for one of the higher options. Samsung has updated the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth specs, so now all three models offer Bluetooth 5.3 and Wi-Fi 6E. Sadly, they didn't completely unify the lineup because ultra-wideband tech is still reserved for the Plus and Ultra only. Now, it's not exactly something I use often, but it does enable cool features like precise location tracking for things like Galaxy Smart Tags. But arriving now at the most crucial internal upgrade, we have new processors. Finally, Samsung has relented and given us not only an overclocked version of the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip, but Snapdragon worldwide. As someone in the UK has had to endure the disappointment of the, let's face it, inferior Exynos processors, I could not be more happy to see this change. Looking at the benchmarks then, this is how the phones compare. We're getting significant gains in performance across the board in both processing speed and for the graphics as well. The advancement from the S22 series is quite a lot bigger than those were from the S21s. With the 3D Mark tests, I was seeing pretty much double the frame rates. These are now beating the iPhone 14 Pro, so the increase to the graphical power is pretty substantial. You're going to see smoother frame rates, faster loading times, and the performance boost is absolutely a highlight for the S23 series. As for how the Ultra compares to the regular S23s, people often assume the bigger and more expensive Ultra will perform best, but this isn't what the numbers or actually using these phones will tell you. The S23 can even outperform the Ultra with certain tasks, and I expect that's because of the displays. It has fewer pixels to process. Of course, the other way to look at this is that the Ultra is keeping up, but at 1440p instead of 1080. Plus, the extra RAM models will give that little bit extra in terms of sustaining background apps to give a smoother experience. This essentially means that any casual users can comfortably choose any of these three phones and not worry about the performance, whilst the power users will already know that they want the Ultra instead. If you were considering last year's S22 series, then they of course will be plenty fast and powerful enough for the average user. But yes, the performance gain this year is genuinely awesome. However, it's actually the efficiency of the new processors that I'm somehow even more impressed with. Alongside these gains, the S23 and Plus also get a 200 mAh battery size increase, which is impressive given that the phones are basically the same size as the S22s. The Ultra has the same 5000 mAh cell, but all three phones have significantly improved battery compared to last year, so we know the new Snapdragon chips are much more efficient. I'll give you some battery stats you can compare the results to last year and get some context. We know that the battery life actually dipped last year with the S22s, but the S23s not only restore that, but go even further to provide the best battery life yet. Given how much faster these phones are as well, that's seriously impressive. I use the phones identically with reasonably heavy use, testing out the cameras, a bit of gaming, social media browsing, and watching videos, and this is how the phones compare to each other at the end of the day. What was interesting was seeing the Plus come out on top ahead of the Ultra, something I actually saw on most days. However, you can adjust the Ultra's settings, for instance dropping the resolution down to 1080p to increase the battery life. I just personally like to use it at its full potential. But if you simply want the Galaxy with the best battery life, don't be fooled by the spec sheet. It's actually the S23 Plus you should go for. But look at how these numbers compare to the S22 series. Again, after using the phones identically, the S23 has a significant lead over last year's model. I saw a similar difference with the Plus and Ultras as well, and the battery life increases are the single best reason to go for a new S23 rather than last year's phones. So if you like the idea of a more comfortable and compact form factor, but have always been concerned about the battery life, I think this is a great year to try out the smaller S23, because its battery life is fantastic. In terms of charging, we have pretty much the same speeds as before, except the S23 was slightly slower, likely on account of that new larger battery. It makes sense since it uses the same 25-watt charging speed as last year, whilst the Plus and Ultra can both charge with 45 watts. We've seen before that this power difference doesn't actually have a huge impact on the total charging time, but as you can see, it is effective for that fast charging period early on. And if you want to get those super fast speeds, you're going to need a fast charger, and I would recommend today's sponsor UGREEN. This is the Nexode 140-watt GaN-Tech charger. It's a 3-in-1 adapter with 2 USB-C ports and 1 USB-A, and with that huge power output, you could even charge up 2 laptops and a phone simultaneously. It supports power delivery 3.1 and can fast charge the Ultra at the full 45 watts, or even something like my M1 MacBook Pro delivering over 50% in less than 30 minutes. There's a bundle available now that also comes with a really nice quality 2-meter nylon braided USB-C cable. So check out the link in the video description for this, and for a discount code as well. Taking a look at the software, there's a temporary upgrade in that the S23 series launches with OneUI 5.1, which brings a number of mostly minor, but a lot of quality of life improvements. Obviously, the S22 series will be getting this software update in the near future as well, but for now I just wanted to mention some cool updates including smoother animations, this new battery widget which I really like, a bunch of new connectivity improvements, and new features in the camera app, like the option for warmer selfies, and best of all, Expert RAW built directly in. This for me is one of the best OneUI updates ever, and makes this so much more accessible than having to download and use a separate app. It gives you near complete control over every lens on the phone. My only gripe is that you can't add this to the carousel of camera modes, but it still gives you much quicker access to advanced camera features, including the new astrophoto mode for capturing the night sky. So let's take a full look into those cameras because on the surface, it doesn't look like a lot has changed. The S23 and Plus actually have the same 3 rear cameras as last year, they just have new 12 megapixel selfie lenses. The Ultra gets this new selfie lens too, which is actually a downgrade from last year's 40 megapixel lens. However, it also gets a new 200 megapixel main lens on the back, so we'll see how those compare. With the new Snapdragon chipset though, we have new ISPs and optimization, and what's clear is that Samsung has moved back towards a more processed look with greater contrast and saturation. They're pushing the dynamic range with brighter highlights especially, but zooming in, you can also see an improvement with the sharpness as well. Another example here seems pretty similar at first, perhaps only the increased saturation that's obvious, but once again when you crop in, you can see the greater sharpness and detail with the S23s. One slight downgrade is with the high-res mode. You can see here switching over to it, you get quite a heavy green tint on the S23, whilst the S22 was more consistent. There are still improvements here though, the level of detail is great, and actually there's a lot less noise with the newer phones as well, so I hope Samsung can just tweak the colours with a software update. Comparing the Ultras side by side, again with the new processing we get more vibrant and striking images, but the new lens also gives a shallower depth of field. This is also a great example of the improvement to autofocus. These were taken in auto mode without tap to focus, and in general I noticed the S23 Ultra had much better autofocusing capability. The Ultras follow the trend of brighter and more saturated photos, and zooming in, you can see the increase in sharpness and detail as well. Now I'll switch over to the respective high-res modes and you can see a similar difference in quality, but the S23 Ultra's 200 megapixels comes out on top. It also has a middle 50 megapixel mode you can choose, and I actually think in this instance it works even better. The focus plane isn't quite as shallow, and yet images still appear cleaner and more detailed than the S22's 108 megapixel mode, even when using the detail enhancer. What I like most though is firstly how much less noise there is. Samsung's over-sharpening isn't as aggressive this year, so images typically turn out looking cleaner. But also the shutter speed is massively improved. Detail-enhanced 108 megapixel shots can take around 5 seconds to process, whilst the new 200 megapixel mode takes barely longer than a regular shot on the S23 Ultra. The resulting file sizes are very similar as well, so the new lens is actually a really nice upgrade from last year. Now as for how the S23 and Plus compare to the Ultra, it's much closer. In the default photo mode, the Ultra shots tend to be slightly brighter and warmer, but even with the high-res modes, the difference can be quite subtle. You need to be smart with how you use the Ultra's camera, especially the 200 megapixel mode, and in some situations, the extra sharpening that the regular photo mode gets can mean those photos actually look better. Some subjects though, like pets, are a perfect example of where the Ultra's high-res mode shines. In the default modes, features like fur can be way over-sharpened, and the contrast is too high as well, so it looks unnatural. but look how much things improve switching to the high-res images. Notice once again the Ultra's warmer, brighter colours, but also, if I crop back out here, how it's able to keep that HDR processing like it does with the normal photo mode. The regular S23 is now overexposed, and HDR issues when using the high-res mode is something we saw last year too. Even when switching up to the full 200 megapixels, the Ultra still has the superior HDR, so that's already a big advantage. But zooming in, just look at the level of detail the Ultra is able to capture. This YouTube video will likely not do the difference justice, nor will the small screen you're likely watching on, but in certain scenarios, that 200 megapixel lens can be seriously impressive. Okay, and finishing off the main lens with the portrait modes, this year the AI seems a lot better with subject detection, and you can see it's been able to blur around the subject here, whilst the S22 has basically not even registered a subject for portrait mode. With the Ultras, both did apply the portrait effect, but it's kind of patchy with the S22 Ultra, and this year's looks much more natural. I can't say the same for the colours though, and the warm white balance and high saturation is very noticeable here with the S23 Ultra. I think portraits work better with the telelens though, and the S22 Ultra has done a better job with the HDR here, and again looks more realistic. I'd actually say the regular S23 portraits look better, and weren't as overly warm and saturated in colour, but once again last year's HDR did seem better, so not everything is an improvement. Moving on to zoom performance, without a change in the lens itself, there are only subtle improvements with the S23, and again it's mainly with the saturation and contrast. Here at 10x zoom you can really see the advantage of that, plus the HDR is actually a lot better with handling the harsh sunlight. Pushing up to 30x, the difference is much smaller as both phones struggle at their maximum zoom, but actually I think the sharpening on the S23s does introduce more noise. With the Ultras there's a clear step up in quality with that secondary dedicated telephoto lens extending the range. Once again the S23's higher saturation really brings these images to life. But moving up the zoom range, the extra sharpness is clear in the grass and the trees, but the over-brightening is causing issues here at 10x. It seems to balance out a bit at 30x, but now it's the S22 Ultra revealing more detail in the shadows. So overall, there's not really any substantial improvement in the zoom quality over the S22 Ultra. If you were comparing the regular S23 and Plus with the Ultra though, that's where you'll see the Ultra's advantage. I think most people would be happy enough with the S23 zoom up to around 10x, and that should cover most situations. But the Ultra's optical zoom is definitely sharper, and if you want to go above this, then that's the reason to choose the Ultra instead. Now with night mode, you can see here in these ultra-wide lens shots that the extra brightness works really well, adding a lot of shadow detail without adding noise. But switching to the main lens, the improvement is even greater. The S23 shot is much sharper, there's far less noise, and the contrast is very good, especially given how little light there was. I think this shot here shows off the difference even more. We're not only getting a sharper and better detailed image, but the colour accuracy is a lot better too. If we crop in here you can see just how much noise the S22 adds in trying to artificially raise the exposure. The S23 is cleaner, and look at the extra detail you get even in the background of this shot. With the Ultras it's a similar story. Here's a slightly different angle on that ultra-wide shot, and once again there's now a lot more shadow detail. But also pay attention to the swan, which isn't as blurred with the S23 Ultra, and that's because the exposure time was shorter. And that's an improvement I often saw with the main lens as well. So here is that main lens shot, and the S23 Ultra's performance is extremely impressive. It has great control over the colours, the highlights that aren't overexposed like on the left, and again it's a sharper image with less motion blur. Here's a particularly tricky shot with very bright highlights compared to an almost black background, but look at the level of detail the S23 Ultra is able to capture here. That new wider aperture main lens seems to handle low light conditions much better. I think most of the low light improvement though is down to the processing, so the Ultra is not really that much better than the regular S23 and Plus. Here you can see that the Ultra reveals more shadow detail and controls the highlight exposure a bit better, so that part comes from the larger sensor and wider aperture. But actually the shallower depth of field means the background details aren't as sharp as on the S23, and the sky is a bit more true to life on the left. So that larger sensor can work well, especially during the day in creating a nice blurred background. But in some situations like nighttime, I certainly prefer the extra detail the regular S23s provide. Moving on to video, the S23s once again provide better colour saturation and the video doesn't look as washed out. I think there's been improvement with the smoothness and stability as well. The S22 video does still appear sharper and sometimes this can look better, but I personally prefer the more natural look this year. With the Ultras, the S23 interestingly doesn't appear as saturated or sharpened. However, pay attention to the focus, because those autofocus improvements make a massive difference when it comes to video. Quite a lot of the S22 Ultra's frame becomes blurred, so there's a really nice improvement to video this year. In case you missed it, I'll freeze frame where Lily was close to the camera, and the difference is absolutely huge. As for the S23 versus Ultra comparison, the Ultra's video did often appear slightly more saturated and even sharper. But one really interesting thing I noticed was that the regular S23 and Plus had smoother footage. These were both originally recorded in 60 frames per second, so you may not see their differences clearly here, but it almost seems like the Ultra's video is at a lower frame rate, and the motion isn't quite as smooth, so hopefully this is something Samsung can fix going forwards. And finally, with the front cameras, we have new 12 megapixel sensors for the S23 series, but what stands out initially is that they're not as overly brightened or sharpened. Now, sometimes this can work well for selfies, but the S23 image is far more lifelike. If you look at how much darker and more saturated my hair is, you can see there's a more natural looking contrast. With that higher resolution, you don't need to artificially sharpen as much, and as a result there's now less noise with selfies too. The colour accuracy is much better now as well, with the skin tones especially not looking as green. Those changes carry over to the portrait mode as well, but there's not really any changes with the portrait effect this year. Now, comparing the Ultras is interesting because we've got a 40 megapixel sensor on the S22 Ultra and a downgraded 12 megapixel lens for the new S23 Ultra. Now, first of all, those same colour and exposure improvements are brought to the S23 Ultra as well. That's definitely an improvement. But you can tell that the resolution isn't quite as good now. I just wanted to point that out, but I think you do have to pixel peep to really notice that, and on the whole the other processing improvements still make for better selfies this year.
Okay, so this is testing out the front-facing video on the new S23 series, and I'll leave the sound on so that you can hear the microphone samples from both of the phones. Don't forget the S23 has a new front-facing sensor and has a new processor, so there's a fair chance that the S23 footage will look better. And certainly from what I can see in the preview, it looks like the HDR is being handled much better on the new S23 series. I'll also compare this directly with the S23 Ultra to see how the regular S23s compare with that. But yeah, let me know what you guys think.
Okay, so I left those sound samples in so you could hear the richer microphone quality this year. I heard that with the Ultra as well, and that's the first improvement. But also notice how dark the contrast is on last year's phones, which may appear to look good on a small screen, but it's not realistic. I'll let the two Ultra videos play out now at the same time, and just looking across these four samples, you can see the improvement with the autofocus on the S23s. Looking back at these post-processing, I'm not so sure the HDR is actually that much better. It's kind of mixed. However, I would say the overall selfie video quality is definitely improved this year. On the whole, I'm pleased with the general tweaks and upgrades this year, in particular with the low light performance. I'm especially happy to have Snapdragon image processing now, since we've seen previously how this was a relative weakness for the Exynos versions, and certainly the reduction in noise this year seems like a big improvement thanks to making that switch. The quality of the Ultra's new lens definitely seems higher, and the autofocus and detail improvements are clear to see. But whether or not you prefer this new bold and saturated image processing, one of the more notable changes from last year, is down to personal preference. With the S23 and Plus versus the Ultra, personally, I think the regular S23 cameras are more than good enough for most people, are plenty versatile, and match the Ultra in the vast majority of situations. But if you want the very highest quality main lens and that extra zoom performance, then those are the reasons to go for the Ultra instead. So let's summarise the upgrades this year with the S23 series. The focus this year has not been on the design or display, and even the camera really only got subtle tweaks, none of which I would consider to be a deal breaker. The S23 upgrade is all about performance. Those new Snapdragon processors offer blistering speeds, insane graphics performance, and a healthy upgrade to the battery life. That last point in particular is a great reason to spend extra on the new lineup. Whilst you may not notice that extra speed every day, you've got to think long term, and how well these phones are going to perform and last in a few years. But spend extra you will likely have to do, because although in the US these launch at the same prices as last year, in the UK and other regions there has been a steep price increase for the S23s, so switching from Exynos to Snapdragon sadly comes at a cost. Last year's S22 and S22 Plus are now heavily discounted on Samsung.com, which means that as much as I like the new lineup, I'd still recommend getting last year's models for most people. But if you can wait just a few months for the S23s to come down in price as well, I think that could be the best way to go. Interestingly, with the Ultra, last year's models are still full price, so if you're already set on getting an Ultra, 100% go for the new S23 Ultra. For those of you just generally set on the S23 series but still undecided between models, as always the size of the phone you're looking for is the single most important thing you should consider. That should trump any of the other small spec or feature differences. How big the display you're using is versus how easily these fit in your hand and pocket are major factors. The S23 Plus strikes the sweet spot with that big flat display, the longest battery life, and all of the key features of the Ultra. For me, it's the best Galaxy this year. The Ultra remains the ultimate powerhouse, and for some, features like the S Pen, the boxy design, or even just the extra 0.2 inches on the display are essential. I just personally don't need those. But there's a clear standout winner in terms of value for money in the smaller S23. A $200 and £200 price jump between phones puts into perspective how little there is between them, and what's great this year is the huge battery improvement, which makes the S23 a viable option for so many more people now. As I said, those of you who've been worried in the past about the battery life of the small phone, this is the year for you to go for it. Personally, that's the one I'll be going for. I've been waiting to finally get a Snapdragon Galaxy, and having that kind of power and performance inside of a smaller form factor is the deal breaker for me. But let me know which of these new phones you'll be getting down in the comments section. Next up, we'll be seeing how the S23 Ultra compares against other flagships in the Pixel 7 Pro and the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you know when that video goes live. Please like this video if you found it helpful, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.